So welcome all to the first episode of Let's Talk About Access with Alex. I'm extremely honored and happy to have for this first episode somebody that I can call friend, first of all, Brian Driscoll, previously in Avenue Medical and now the CEO of Ellipsys Medical, but actually got back Ellipsus from Medtronic. And I'm sure that many people have plenty of questions and are pretty curious to know what happened and what's next. So, Brian, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure to be your first guest. I'm excited, obviously, to connect with you again, and as well as to share this, the story of Ellipsys Medical and the resurgence of the Ellipsus access system.
Perfect. So, what went wrong, if anything, with Ellipsis and Medtronic? Was Ellipsis a problem? Was Medtronic the problem? Was it doctors, physicians, the patients, dialysis units?
Yeah, I think, it's probably a multitude of factors. Ultimately, it's certainly not the technology. The one thing that's very clear is the Ellipsis device works. It successfully creates percutaneous fistula. Those patients are able to dialyze, utilize the fistula. You look at the data, it's incredibly strong, incredibly consistent, regardless of the study that you review. I think the challenge has been the market development aspect of it. There's one thing about fistula creation, but then there's the ongoing maintenance and the dialysis aspect of it, successful cannulation, et cetera. It's a pretty heavy lift to manage those additional issues. And large companies like Medtronic aren't necessarily as set up for market development activities. And I think the need to go beyond the access creation, getting into not necessarily the maintenance, but certainly the cannulation piece is a challenge for companies like Medtronic. And I think that's ultimately was essentially kind of the downfall of it. I think what's interesting is because of the struggles with that, and when you have a company like Medtronic that backs out of the market, it sort of was a wake up call to the interventionalists out there that, they can create a fistula and they kind of wash their hands and say, oh, we're done with this now. That's not the case. They have to manage this patient all the way through the continuum of care. They've got to be involved with the dialysis centers. They've got to work with the cannulation aspect of this all and owning that patient and that patient journey from patient selection all the way through to successful cannulation is necessary. And I think that's one of the things again, we learned a lot during the Avenue Medical days, everything from how to create the fistula, but then ultimately how to dialyze them. And again, we'll lean into that and utilize that as a way to grow this market and get it back on its feet again.
So, do you think that Medtronic, let's say, underestimated the challenges that they may have, and they probably manage this as if it was an acquisition of another device, like a different kind of stent or a different kind of stent graft or whatever?
Absolutely. I think that's the biggest challenge is that it was, traditionally kind of seen as like a bolt on, like, oh, this is just an extension of what we do already. That's not really the case. This is a market development project. It takes a little more time and effort to grow it, to get it established, et cetera. And this isn't just another balloon or another catheter or another wire. It's not a commodity device. It requires, a little bit more development, and that's not something that the bigger companies are necessarily suited for.
So, I mean, of course, you know the device very well because your team has developed the device, and I
Hmm.
was happy to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Um, but what are you gonna go do different? How are you gonna fix things now? Did you have the manpower to go forward and make it different?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge we have. As I mentioned earlier, I think part of this is part of what will make this successful. What we'll do differently now is having the physicians, the interventionalists that are creating these specialists more engaged and more involved. The other thing that's a little bit different about this is I think instead of going to all the providers out there, it's going deep. I always like to use that Jerry Maguire reference that, less is more, going deeper, fewer clients, more, in developing deeper relationships. I think the access centers And those centers like yours and centers here in the United States that really focus on vascular access and vascular access creation, those are the right sites of service for this technology, where they are ultimately owning or doing a fairly large volume of access creations. And really ultimately not just creations, but maintaining these fistulas, working through the challenges. Again, you can have a perfectly functional fistula that may have problems after dialysis or due to some cannulation injuries, et cetera. Owning that patient all the way through that journey is going to be important. So I think working with those experts, those that are really deeply involved in access creation, is the key. Not taking it to every hospital, every dialysis center across the country. It's finding centers of excellence, creating centers of excellence that can own this from beginning to end.
Yeah, but this means that you're probably not going to do too many cases if you have only a few centers, or this will be the first stage.
I actually early on, certainly will be a controlled launch. We are starting from scratch as far as manufacturing goes. We have to build clean room and build product from the beginning, get it requalified, et cetera. We expect that by midsummer, we should start to ship our initial devices, and then eventually we'll grow the manufacturing and be able to produce more and more. So yes, early on it'll be somewhat limited, but we expect to expand. I will say that you can look at, I mean, there are centers that have done, well over 100 procedures in a year. That's not an ordinary. So I think at the end of the day, there still could be a lot of procedures done and a lot of percutaneous specialists created. It just happens to be through fewer centers versus doing a bunch of individual sites doing a handful of cases. We want to build these centers of excellence that could do a lot. You look at Dr. Sharoff in San Antonio, Texas. Since 2018, he's done over 1,200 ellipsis procedures. He just reported on 1,000, those first 1,000 that he did at Aston this past February.
Wow.
So it shows that it can be done. And we have many other centers that have done well over 100 or 200 or 300 procedures over the past few years. So the volume is there. There are opportunities to develop these centers of excellence and develop these experts, as it were, in fistula creation, via the Ellipsis system.
So just now that you mentioned numbers, do you have any idea how many thousands of ellipsis fistulas we have around the world at this moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in fact, I was just kind of doing some digging, doing some research to kind of come up with that number. And at this point, I estimate there's at least 10,000 ellipsis procedures that have been successfully performed since the device was originally FDA approved in 2018, and that's globally. So, majority of those have been done here in the United States, but obviously, you have a vast experience with it there in
About
Paris. You
about 5%. About a five.
how many are you up to?
About I think around 500.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, that puts you up there towards the top. But we've had experiences in New Zealand and Singapore, all over the globe. Ellipsis has been used, but obviously the majority of that experience has been here in the United States.
And you know what I want to say is that 10,000 fistulas, it's not huge, it's not a million, but it's a big number. And
Mm-hmm.
what we can say for sure is that I've never heard of any serious complications, catastrophes, problems, which is that we definitely have the proof that this is a safe technology. Not it works, but it's also very safe technology. Yeah.
Completely agree. If you look at the FDA mod database, there's very low reports of device-related complications or complications in general. And then you take a look at the data. Obviously the IDE trial that has come out. We have now 5-year data on that. The functional patency at 5 years was still close to 92%, which is exceptionally high. Then you look at Dr. Troff's data that I referenced earlier. Again, 1,000 patients, single site study almost mirrored the ID experience, and this is a completely different patient population. It's a different physician that was involved in the IDE's trials. So, apples to apples, but different users, same results.
Mm.
Same thing. And then the post-market study that Dr. Wasay presented at Aston as well. Those results were actually slightly better than the ID trial, which makes sense when you think about it, because again, you were involved with this. There was a pivotal moment in the very end of the IDE trial, and then in the commercial trials where we started doing the balloon angioplasty at the time of creation. And that significantly improves not just the patency, but reduces the number of interventions required to get that patient or to get that fistula matured.
Yeah.
And that, again, you look at the data from the post-market that Dr. Wesley presented, the 1,000-patient study from Dr. Schroff, and then our original ID trial, along with the publications that you've put out, Dr. Cheverdian's put out. What's remarkable is regardless of the site of service, regardless of the physician performing the procedure, it's remarkably consistent. You
Yes.
know,
Correct.
all the patency rates, the secondary procedures, the complications, all of them are remarkably similar. So I think that just speaks to what you're referencing, the idea that the device itself creates a fistula almost consistently the same every single time.
Yeah. You cannot modify it. I mean,
No,
once you start doing the puncture and you do it right, we will all do exactly the same thing.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So consistency is the key here. It's, we know with fistula creation, it's highly variable. Look at this, surgical creation, I should say. You look at the data, physicians that perform less than 25 a year, their outcomes are significantly poorer than those that do 50. I'm sure in your hands, in Dr. Lucas and Dr. Jennings and these physicians that have done thousands of fistulas, surgical fistulas, they get very good results. But the problem is you don't have more than a dozen or maybe 30, let's say, just to be generous, physicians in the world that do that many surgical fistulas that can get to that level of consistency.
Yeah. And if you wish, having interventional nephrologists who do not necessarily have the same skill set like surgeons, being able with the technology create fistulas of the same quality like other
Yes.
experienced vascular surgeons, that's a very, very important thing. I had a discussion yesterday with Kate Steiner and some other colleagues, and something that we mentioned was that the good centers, the places that we had good results, were the centers like places like Kate Steiner
Mhm.
in
Yep.
UK. They had a teamwork, and they were not only screening the patients very well, doing the cases very well, but also following the patients later and supporting the dialysis units, puncture sites.
Yes.
Is this the same experience that you have in the United States?
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, it without question, the key is, and I kind of referenced this earlier, it's that ecosystem. It's making sure that the physician who's ever created, whether it's a vascular surgeon, an IR, an IN, who's ever created a fistula, has to follow those patients, has to be connected to the dialysis centers in order to make sure these things are, these fistulas are followed or maintained, and you're doing everything necessary to make sure this patient can utilize the access that's been created. If there isn't a simple like create the fistula, patient goes home and you never see him again. This is a program, as it were. So it takes constant and consistent communication with the nephrologist and with the dialysis centers. And I think that's part of the one of the not part. This will certainly be a focus of our relaunch of Ellipsis is developing those tools as well as having individuals involved in that process to help facilitate those relationships and making sure that the patients are followed appropriately.
Yeah, because the challenge here is that if you have the physicians like Kate Steiner or Ari Kramer,
Mhm.
the clinical champions
Yep.
who are so dedicated and they already have the right teams in place and the right mentality, then it's effortless. But
Correct.
how can you, like a company, create a structure and a strategy that you are going to reproduce this function without necessarily being dependent to
Yep.
the goodwill or excellence of any particular physician? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of push and pull. So one of the things that we started to delve into before Avenue sold the company off was developing relationships with the big dialysis center, the LDOs, right? Fresenius, DaVita, um, you know, there's a whole host, but those are the two big entities. Working with them to educate their teams so that they own a piece of this as well. At the same time, we're supporting it with having cannulation experts out in the field following our patients in to make sure, especially in those early cases when it might be new to that dialysis center, making sure they understand how this fistula looks, feels. It's not they don't necessarily cannulate any differently. It's more about how they assess it that's slightly different. So teaching them how to assess it appropriately, how to understand that ultrasound could be a key in this. We have some dialysis centers now that actually use ultrasound guided cannulation. That's huge, not just for our fistulas, but for any fistula. But getting, embracing that and helping them take advantage of the tools, technologies that are out there. But I think the key long-term success here is getting the large dialysis organizations on board so that this becomes part of the curriculum, part of what they do to train their teams, because ultimately it's a benefit for them as well. If we can, if a functional patency is at 92%, give or take, that's huge for that. That means less missed dialysis visits, less time that they're not in a chair, all these kind of factors that would benefit a DaVita or a Fresenius as well.
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of move the subject now to something bit more business oriented, and perhaps
Mhm.
something that many people are going to be very curious about. So it's very obvious that you love it. It's your baby. I'm
Yes.
sure it's the same thing for Mark and Ned and
Yeah.
Jeff and all the gang of
Yeah.
Avenue, yeah, Steven and
Yeah.
everybody, all the good friends. But was it just an emotional decision that you just didn't want it to die, or it was, I'm guessing, a business decision? And what is the strategy of this business? Are you aiming to just make good sales and make money out of it, or be able to sell it again in another big company?
That's a great question. I think it ultimately, first of all, it is definitely our baby. We're passionate about this space, right? We worked extremely hard, spent many years developing the technology, figuring out how to make it work, figuring out how to get it into the right centers, build these programs. And it was a little bit frustrating to watch it kind of teeter and potentially even go away, right? And ultimately has gone away now for close to the last year. I think there's a piece of this that is about making sure we're so passionate about this patient population and the technology and how this can really help those patients in need of dialysis. We recognize these patients have a lot of comorbidities. They have a lot of illnesses, other things that are going on. They spend a tremendous amount of time in the hospital, in the doctor's offices, et cetera. If we can make their life just a little bit easier by giving them a simpler place, instead of going to a hospital to have a fistula creation, you can go into an outpatient center, have the have the procedure done in 30 minutes, and go home, and then be dialyzing a month later. That's such an improvement in their quality of life compared to what the alternatives are. So having access to this technology is important for us. Having patients have the ability to potentially have this as an option for them so they don't have to go across town. So part of this is about helping those patients get access to this technology again. We don't want to see it go away because we believe in it. We know it can work. We know it can have a major impact for these patients' quality of life. So that's part of it. Ultimately, where this goes, hard to say. As the market grows and as we develop it, as we create a blueprint for how to really launch this, maybe it does end up back in the hands of a large company, or at least a larger company than Ellipsys Medical. It's going to be tough for a small company like ourselves to get international. And I think when we sold the technology the first time around, part of the goal here was, can we get it out to Europe? Can we get it in the Asia Pacific rim? Can we get it to other parts of the world? For a company like ours, both at Avenue now and Ellipsis Medical, it's difficult to get beyond the US. It just takes so much more work, effort, infrastructure to do that. And if you really truly want to get this technology to the masses, that's really the only way to go about it. So it's hard to say what the future looks like, but our primary goal, the reason we're back in this again, is to get more patients to keep, I should say, access to this technology for our dialysis patients.
And I commend you and I congratulate you for this, Brian. I know you very well to be sure that this is a very honest and very good intention. I know that you do things for the right reasons. Um, so another question: how worried are you about the competition? There was Wavelink.
Sure.
At some point, people were even mixing these two things. Some people that didn't know very well, sometimes they were thinking that it was the same, almost the same thing, and the
Mhm.
AVF.
Sure.
Um, I don't see many people doing cases in Europe. I'm not sure how they, if they're still active in the United States. And it's sure that when Medtronic kind of decided to abandon Ellipsis, everybody said endoAVF is dead, and they felt the same thing for wavelength for some reason.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
of course, now you have a new device
Mhm.
as well, which is, I must say, very similar. It looks very
Mhm.
similar. At least the device itself, the handle looks awful similar
Yes.
to Ellipsis. So, how worried are you about them? And what do you think it's going to be
Yeah.
the impact on Ellipsis?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, the imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So, I take that as a compliment that we both must have been doing something right. But honestly, I think a rising tide floats all boats. I think the more players that are in the space, the better it is. As I mentioned, the whole dialysis aspect of it all, the more effort we have to educate and push the dialysis centers to do a better job or to adopt technology to better cannulate these patients, the better it is for everybody. So, if it's just us out there, we're the only ones pushing it. It's a very, very, very heavy lift. If Wavelength is out there, if they're promoting it, Bard has the team supporting it, working not just for creations, but also for the access, maintenance and the ongoing dialysis or cannulation. That's huge. That's very in it's incredibly important to have more than just one entity making that happen. So I see it, I welcome it. I don't mind that at all. I think at the end of the day, again, we know ellipsis isn't for every patient either, right? We know that a majority of patients can be a good candidate for this, but there's going to be a patient out there that may not be a right option, where ellipsis isn't the right option. Maybe they are better off having a wavelength. Maybe they're better for a surgical fistula or a graft or whatever that option may be. At the end of the day, again, think about the Kadoki guidelines, right? Access with the right patient at the right time. You need more than one option. Now, hopefully, Ellipsis does take a large percentage of those patients, and we're eligible, make them eligible for dialysis via, or sorry, access creation via the Ellipsis, but it's not going to be for everybody. So I think it's good that there are other devices, other options, um, for physicians, for patients alike.
So, what's the timeline? What's the next step? When are you starting again to actually do patients? And are we
Yeah.
going to do patients in Europe, in France? Am I going to get my hand to the device? I guess not.
So you will eventually. It's going to be a while. We have started. We basically had to start from scratch. We have a building. We've got a clean room assembled. Now we're going through the validation process and qualifying sterility, all the biocom testing, all these things that have to be done. So our goal is to have possibly by the middle of summer to start shipping our first devices. And then we'll be ramping up production after that. So if everything goes as planned, we should start shipping in July. And then, as the fall comes around, we'll be able to get to more and more centers. Then on a regulatory front, we have to register. We're a new company, a new entity. So we have to reestablish ourselves in Europe. We have to reestablish ourselves for anywhere outside the United States, basically. So, that whole registration process depends on the country and the requirements, et cetera. But it'll take some time, a lot of paperwork, and some finesse there to help accelerate. It does help that we have a device that has history. It already has the 510K approval here in the de novo 510K here in the United States. So it's not like it's completely from scratch, but there's a fairly heavy lift when it comes to the regulations that we have to do in order to bring it back. So hopefully, I'll be coming to Paris here soon, with some devices in hand for you.
Well, if there is anyone or any team that is going to be able to make this happen, it's your team, and all the good friends there that I miss dearly, I must say. So please say hello to everybody.
I
Uh,
will.
it was a great honor for me to do this first episode of my brand new podcast. Let's talk about access with Alex. I'm hoping we will do more, and let's see how it goes. Try and join us in a couple of weeks for the next episode. I'm not decided yet who is going to be the person we're going to invite, but it's always going to be interesting access, and we always say the truth and try to educate you and entertain you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Mallios. Good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, sir.